In the endless, wind-swept plains of Arkansas in 1915, the town of Willow Creek seemed almost forgotten by the world. Wooden cottages leaned slightly under the weight of age, and the streets were more dust than stone. Life moved slowly here, dictated by the seasons, by the rising and setting sun, and by the occasional visitor who passed through on the old dirt road. Among these cottages was a modest little shop with a faded sign, Whitmore Threads. The shop was simple, sturdy wooden shelves lined with fabric of every hue, a few spools of thread, and a single sewing machine that had seen better days. Here lived Eleanor Whitmore, a seamstress known for her uncanny skill. Eleanor's fingers were nimble, her eyes sharp, and yet, for all her talent, she carried a quiet sadness. The loss of her mother when she was young had left her with a certain loneliness that no stitch could entirely fill. Every day she poured herself into her work, carefully mending torn hems and creating new garments, her needle gliding like a painter's brush across fabric. Though the town appreciated her skill, few understood the strange devotion she had to her craft. Every stitch was more than a mere repair. It was a whisper of attention, a memory captured, a piece of a person's story sewn into the very fabric. It was a warm spring morning when the first unusual visitor arrived. Clara Benson, a young woman with sun-streaked hair and calloused hands, carried a dress that had been torn while helping her father in the barn. The cotton fabric was frayed, the seam ripped, and she feared it might be beyond repair. Eleanor examined the dress, running her fingers lightly over the torn threads. "This can be fixed," she said softly, her voice like a calm lullaby. Clara watched her with a mix of hope and skepticism. "There's something different about you," Clara said finally. "You work so carefully. It's like you're listening to it." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Every garment has a story," she replied quietly, "and every story deserves to be treated with care." As she stitched, Eleanor didn't just repair the fabric. She listened to Clara's hesitations, her small sighs, the quiet resilience in her posture. Each stitch carried a sliver of the young woman's energy, her laughter, her determination, and the quiet hope she had nearly forgotten. That night, Eleanor sat by her sewing table, bathed in the soft glow of a single oil lamp. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, the comforting scent of home. She picked up scraps from Clara's dress, running her hands over the soft cotton. As she worked, she hummed a lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child, a song that spoke of courage and love. Her needle moved almost of its own accord, and the threads seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. To anyone else, it was merely sewing. But Eleanor's method was unique. She stitched not only with thread, but with attention, empathy, and care. Each stitch contained a fragment of her customer's essence, a tiny piece of who they were, woven into something that could be worn, held, or cherished. This strange gift had always been part of her, though she had never spoken of it. To Eleanor, it was as natural as breathing, an act of remembrance, of connection, and of quiet love. As the days passed, the townsfolk began to notice something unusual about Eleanor's creations. Clothes repaired or made by her seemed to carry life. A farmer's jacket made by Eleanor felt sturdier, almost protective. A dress sewn for a shy girl seemed to lift her spirits, her laughter brighter than before. Rumors began to circulate. Some whispered of witchcraft, others of miracles. One woman claimed that her baby slept more peacefully in a dress Eleanor had made, as if the stitches themselves comforted the child. Eleanor paid little mind to gossip. She did not seek praise, nor did she want attention. She simply worked, carefully threading stories into fabric, knowing that sometimes the world needed quiet magic more than noise. One chilly afternoon, Mr. Abernathy, a stern and solitary widower, came into the shop. His coat was threadbare, the buttons barely holding on. "Can you make it Feel new? He asked, almost ashamed of the request. Eleanor studied him carefully, noting the deep lines on his face, the shadow of loss in his eyes. She nodded and took the coat. As she worked, she stitched not only the torn seams, but also memories of his late wife, the gentle laughter he had almost forgotten, the comfort of evenings spent together. When Mr. Abernathy wore the coat the next morning, he felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. A single tear slipped down his cheek as he remembered love lost but not forgotten. Eleanor watched from her doorway, quietly satisfied, knowing that a stitch could sometimes mend more than fabric. It could mend the heart. A few weeks later, a little girl named Lillian visited Eleanor's shop with her mother. Lillian was shy, often retreating behind her mother's skirts, her eyes wide with hesitation. It was her birthday, and her mother had saved for a special dress. Eleanor worked with care, adding tiny embroidered flowers to the hem and sleeves. She whispered encouragement to the child as she sewed, letting threads carry hope, laughter, and the courage to stand tall. When Lillian finally twirled in front of the mirror, her small face lit up with delight. The timidity melted away, replaced by confidence and joy. Her mother gasped, whispering, "It's like she's changed." Eleanor only smiled, knowing that the dress had done more than cover her body. It had touched her spirit. One autumn afternoon, a man named Jonas Blackwood arrived in Willow Creek. A traveling photographer, he had spent years wandering the country and carried the weariness of countless roads in his eyes. His coat was ragged, his hat bent and faded. Curious about the whispers surrounding Whitmore threads, he stepped inside. Eleanor greeted him with her usual gentle smile. He observed her working silently, fascinated by the almost meditative precision of her hands. "Why do you care so much about clothes?" he finally asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. Eleanor paused, her eyes lifting to meet his. "Because each person leaves a part of themselves behind. I just make sure it stays alive," she said softly, her words hanging in the air like a delicate thread. Jonas returned days later, determined to understand Eleanor's methods. He watched as she stitched, her hands moving with fluid grace. "Do you really sew pieces of people into their clothing?" he asked, hesitant. Eleanor nodded. "It is not magic," she explained, "but empathy. Each person carries stories, moments, and emotions. I honor them with every stitch. When someone wears a piece I've worked on, they carry a reminder of who they are, even in their darkest moments." Jonas was fascinated, realizing that what he had thought was superstition was actually a deep understanding of human connection, made tangible in thread and fabric. Word of Eleanor's unusual talent spread. Some were enchanted, seeking her work for themselves, while others were wary, whispering about witchcraft and strange powers. The local preacher warned against it, calling her gifts unnatural. Yet, children begged their parents for dresses by Miss Whitmore, and elderly villagers felt inexplicable comfort in her creations. Eleanor ignored the whispers. She had never sought approval or recognition. Her work was not for fame or fortune. It was a simple, quiet act of love and remembrance. In each stitch, she reminded the world that every life, every story mattered. One sultry summer, Eleanor fell gravely ill. Fever consumed her body, leaving her weak and pale. The townsfolk feared for her life. Jonas, who had grown close to her during his visits, stayed by her side, tending to her with the same care she had shown the town for years. Even in her sickness, Eleanor worried for her work. "The stories must continue," she whispered. "Promise me, you will keep sewing their stories." Jonas nodded, understanding for the first time the depth of her purpose. Eleanor had not just created garments, She had created a living memory, a network of empathy stitched into the very fabric of Willow Creek. Despite the fever that burned through her veins, Eleanor insisted on completing one final creation. With trembling hands, she pulled out scraps of fabric, threads, and patches collected from garments she had repaired over the years. She began sewing a grand quilt, each square representing a person she had touched: Clara, Lillian, Mr. Abernathy, and so many others. Every stitch carried a fragment of memory: laughter, sorrow, courage, love, resilience. As Eleanor sewed, she whispered softly, telling the quilt the stories of her customers' lives, their struggles, their triumphs, and the small moments that defined them. When the quilt was finished, Eleanor laid down beside it, exhausted but peaceful. "This is all of us," she murmured. She closed her eyes, knowing her work would live on long after she was gone. That night, the seamstress who had stitched hearts into fabric passed quietly, leaving behind a tangible legacy of love and empathy. Willow Creek mourned Eleanor deeply. The once bustling Whitmore threads now sat silent, the windows dark. Jonas, filled with grief but determined to honor her memory, entered the shop. That's when he discovered the grand quilt, carefully folded on Eleanor's work table. As he touched it, he felt something extraordinary, an almost imperceptible warmth, a gentle vibration of life within the fabric. The quilt was more than a creation, it was a living testament to Eleanor's gift. Each patch seemed to tell a story, each stitch a whisper of laughter, hope, or courage. Jonas realized that Eleanor had woven not just memories, but a thread of unity for the town itself. Jonas began sewing himself, following Eleanor's method. He wasn't sure he could replicate her precision, but he understood the heart behind her work. With each garment, he listened to the story of its wearer, infusing thread with care, patience, and understanding. The villagers noticed subtle changes. Children smiled more freely, the elderly felt lighter, and even those weighed down by grief found comfort in Eleanor's legacy. Jonas learned that Eleanor's work wasn't magic, it was empathy made tangible. A single stitch could remind a person that they mattered, that their life was valued, and that kindness could be woven into everyday existence. Autumn arrived and Willow Creek held its annual fair. Jonas decided to display Eleanor's quilt. The townsfolk approached cautiously, their curiosity mingled with reverence. When they touched it, memories flooded back: the laughter of children, the courage of the widowers, the hope of the mothers. People gasped, hugged one another, and tears welled in many eyes. It was as if Eleanor herself had woven her presence into the very fabric, reminding everyone that even the smallest acts of care could ripple through countless lives. That day, the quilt became a symbol of unity, a mirror of the town's soul. One crisp evening, a woman named Marion Whitmore appeared at the shop. She was Eleanor's distant cousin, a woman of refined manner and quiet determination. She had heard whispers of the seamstress who could weave stories into cloth and wished to preserve Eleanor's gift for future generations. Jonas welcomed her warmly. Together they examined Eleanor's work, discussing how best to continue her mission. Marion shared family tales and insights, revealing a lineage of women who had always valued care, attention, and the preservation of memory through craft. It was clear Eleanor's gift had roots deep in their heritage. Marion and Jonas began training young apprentices, teaching them not only how to sew, but how to listen with their hands and hearts. They learned Eleanor's subtle art. Each stitch could carry joy, courage, or remembrance. Children learned quickly, inspired by the stories of those who had come before. Lillian and Clara, now grown, returned to assist, sharing their experiences and encouraging the younger generation. Willow Creek slowly transformed, Stitched together by empathy and care, it's people learning the quiet power of attention, kindness, and presence. Years passed, and the legend of Eleanor Whitmore spread beyond Willow Creek. One day, a young woman named Amelia, traveling from another state, arrived at Whitmore Threads. Her life had been hard, filled with loss and loneliness. When she draped the quilt over her shoulders, something extraordinary happened. Memories she had never lived seemed to touch her heart, stories of courage, of joy, of survival. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she realized she was not alone. Eleanor's quilt carried the warmth, love, and humanity of countless lives stitched together with care. Amelia stayed to learn the craft, understanding at last that Eleanor's gift was about more than thread. It was about connection, understanding, and the unbroken chain of human kindness. Jonas revealed the quilt's hidden detail. Every patch contained a tiny heart stitched in the corner, almost invisible unless observed carefully. Eleanor had left them as symbols of hope and love. Those hearts reminded anyone who touched the quilt that even in grief, sorrow, or isolation, love endured. People who had never met Eleanor still felt her presence. Children who touched the quilt smiled instinctively. The elderly felt warmth in their hearts. Travelers paused, sensing a subtle connection to humanity. Eleanor's gift had become immortal, a legacy that transcended time and space. Decades later, Willow Creek was no longer just a small, dusty town. It had become a place of healing, learning, and remembrance. Whitmore threads flourished as apprentices trained in Eleanor's method continued to sew garments infused with empathy and care. Eleanor's story became legend. People spoke of her not as a seamstress alone, but as a quiet guardian of human stories, a woman who had understood the hidden value of every life. The town learned a timeless truth that love, care, and attention, even in the smallest forms, could bind a community and heal hearts. One quiet spring, a young girl exploring the old shop found a folded letter tucked inside the original quilt. With hands trembling, she opened it. To anyone who finds this, know that every stitch carries a part of someone who cared, someone who believed, and someone who loved. Keep sewing their stories, and you will never be alone. The girl read the letter, tears in her eyes. She understood that Eleanor had stitched not only memories and emotions into her work, but a roadmap for compassion, connection, and empathy. That day she began her own sewing journey, carrying forward the legacy of a seamstress who had sewn the very essence of humanity into her craft. Eleanor's gift lived on, not just in fabric, but in hearts, actions, and every story touched by the invisible threads of kindness she had left behind.